So in the last video we realised and we understand the terms procedure, arguments, parameters, functions and return values. I've added an extra key word here which is scope. Now scope is probably the hardest of the concepts to understand, and it basically refers to where things are accessible from, which sounds a little bit confusing, so let's go and have a look. So to go back over the example we've got here, we've got a function, and we know it's a function because it's got a return value. And of course this function doesn't run at this time, so the first thing that happens is it stores 5 in first number, it stores 10 in second number, it runs the add function now using 5 and 10. 5 and 10 get added together and we return 15. It returns 15 and stores it in answer, and then we print answer. Now if we were to say let's ignore actually storing this function and having return value, let's just switch it back so it's a procedure. So we just say total equals x plus y, and we're just going to run that procedure, and then we'll just print out, and I want to print out the total because now there's no such thing as answer. So I'll add x and y and we'll store it in total, and then I'll try and print total. If we go and run this program now, it says total is not defined. It says there's no such thing called total. And the reason it thinks there's no such thing called total is only accessible in this function. It's only within the scope of that function. Okay? Now that just means that if you create a variable inside a function, it is not accessible outside of that function. So, or procedure of course in this case. So we could just say we were going to create a new variable in here called monkey, and say monkey equals 4. Now although I do run this procedure, if I decide on the outside that I'd like to maybe not print the total anymore, we'll just print monkey. Again we find this problem that it says there is no such thing as monkey, even though we ran the procedure that should have created monkey, is no longer accessible once this function, or this procedure in this case, has finished running. Now in some languages you can have scope where, as well as variables being inside, you can have functions. So we'll come on to show an example of that. However, I think it's also worth showing you a global variable. So global variables are ones that are created outside of functions. So for example, when I started this program, I could just say, well, let's just store my name, and my name is Tom. Now, because we created it outside of the function and outside of everything, it's a global variable. Now, generally, Python does something rather clever. So if I go inside this function and I tell it to go and print, and I just want to print out whatever is stored in name, just see if that works. And this is slightly different to other languages. It's only complaining about monkey. Let's take out our print for monkey and just see if it works, ignoring that. In fact, we can see it did here. We can see, sure enough, it did print name. Now, that works absolutely fine. However, if I were to try and manipulate name to have a different value in here, so let's just say name equals Dave, and run this program one more time, we can see that Dave is printed. Now let's take one more example. And let's say after all of this we want to print out name again. So the first time we printed out name, it printed out Dave, and the second time it printed out Tom. So name equals Tom in here. We then did these things, which is now irrelevant, we're not doing anything with them, and we called the add procedure. When we did that, we set name equal to Dave. Now interestingly, it doesn't know about this name. It's just said, alright, well, name equals Dave, that's fine, and we print Dave. That's why, actually, when we come out of this procedure, that Dave is no longer is still stored in this version of name, but we've got a global version of name as well, which still stores Tom. This is a separate version of name. That's why when we print name after running the procedure, it still thinks that name is equal to Tom. And just to clarify why that is because name here is a global variable that exists outside of the procedure, and name here, it says, oh, because you've got one outside and we're playing with one inside, I'll just treat this as a local variable. And a local variable is one that's only got the scope within that function. So it's not simple. Of course, the global variable never changed its value once it was set. Now there isn't a way that we can change this. In this case, it's actually saying, well, the value of name inside this procedure is going to be, if we wanted it to be this global variable that we can change. We can tell in Python to import the global variable so that we can use that. And I can just say, yeah, use the global variable name. Now what we should expect to see here, and we'll test it and see if my logic's correct, that we create the variable Tom, we then run this function, this procedure, sorry, and we will then change the global name. So now it says, alright, well this one's now the global variable name, and we'll change that to Dave, and then we'll print Dave. And of course, outside of the scope of the function, because we're changing the global variable name now, that it should print Dave twice, because the actual global variable would have changed. Let's just test to make sure that is the case. Sure enough, that is what's happened. So it's really important to realise that with scope, things have values in functions and out of functions. You have global variables and local variables, which is most of what you're going to need to know. What's worth briefly mentioning is that you can also have functions that are global and local. I'm not sure if they exist inside Python, but just to show you how this might look, we could create a new function called say hello. This will actually be a procedure. So say hello, and we're going to create that inside this function, inside this procedure again, sorry. So say hello is going to just print out the word hello. Now interestingly, we would only be able to call this procedure from this procedure, because this procedure would not exist outside of itself. And that's what we call scope in terms of procedures or functions. Generally, you're only going to have to work with procedures inside of, scope of variables, not scope of functions or procedures. But it's worth just mentioning that you can also have scope in regard to other aspects of coding. And even more complicated, when you start to learn about classes, scope becomes even more important. But you don't need to know that for GCSE.